Hi, respected dignitaries, esteemed scholars, artists, and seekers of wisdom. So, the topic that I'm going to talk about today is mind and meaning, rethinking consciousness beyond empiricism. In the past 2 days, we've had explored some of the most fundamental questions of human existence, which is what is consciousness? How do we experience consciousness? Is reality something objective or is it shaped by perception? Can empirical science truly capture the richness of human experience, or must we expand our ways of knowing and knowledge? These questions shape how we interpret this world, engage with knowledge, and define what it means to be human. So, this was a gathering of diverse perspectives. This conference has brought together philosophers, artists, musicians, scientists, scholars, cultural people, each offering unique insights into the nature of what is consciousness and its diverse manifestation across various disciplines. So, we've seen how philosophy broadens our intellectual frameworks. We've heard how music and rhythm influence cognition and thought. We have explored how art, ritual, storytelling serve as pathways to deeper understanding. We have discussed how science through psychology, neuroscience, and artificial intelligence attempts to map consciousness. But what unites all these diverse discussions is a fundamental challenge. How do we synthesize all these various perspectives, each of which is fully valid? And then we come to the limits of empirical inquiry, which governs the scientific world as we know today. Modern science has made tremendous progress in explaining the brain's biological and computational functions. We can measure brain activity, but can we measure awareness? We can observe neural patterns, but can we quantify love, beauty, intuition, and transcendence? Some of the most profound experiences remain beyond the grasp of measurement. So, this forces us to ask, what kind of knowledge are we leaving out because we are so empirical in our scientific approach? Is something less real simply because it cannot be measured, it cannot be quantified? Should we limit a pursuit of truth to only what that can be measured, empirically validated? Thus, as we conclude this conference, I invite you to reflect on how we can move beyond the constraints of empirical knowledge to embrace a more integrated approach, a one that values direct experience, intuition, and subjective awareness as legitimate modes of knowing. Let us now revisit some of the key insights shared by our distinguished speakers in the last days, as they have laid the groundwork for this inquiry on which we build today the further ideas, the building of ideas, edifice of ideas. So the diverse discussions we've had engaged in, whether on music, dance, aesthetics, philosophy, or folk traditions, point to a deeper truth. Reality is not just something we observe, it is something our consciousness actively constructs. This brings us to an essential realization. What is the relationship between mind and reality? Is mind the architect of reality? Most likely, yes. Is mind the observer of reality, as Vedantic thought teaches us? Yes. So, one of the profound realizations emerging from this conference is that consciousness is not a passive observer of reality, it actually constructs reality. We often assume that reality exists independently of us because the scientific temper, as we know today, the paradigm here is that we are outside what we observe physically, and the universe is outside of us. And so we observe and we make empirical experiments, we discover scientific truth, and that our minds merely perceive reality. But phenomenology, epistemology, and ontology, they challenge this assumption and force us to ask, what if reality is not absolute, but contingent on our perception? If knowledge itself is mental construct, can we ever know truth independent of the mind? Does the world exist as it is, or is it fundamentally shaped by consciousness? To explore these questions, let us break them down into three philosophical perspectives. First is phenomenology, which is reality structured through perception. Phenomenology, as proposed by Edmund and Morris, teaches us that there is no reality independent of perception. Now, this may be true to a point, and there could be difference of views that there is reality outside of these perceptions. But for the purpose of this discussion, we are going to limit our discussion to what we can perceive. And though there could be a reality outside perception, we limit our discussions to what we can perceive and relate to, with the reality outside the mind as the ideal. So consider these example, like two people standing at the same location might see, feel, and interpret environment differently. A trained artist sees shades, textures, and composition in a scene that an untrained observer might overlook. So, a physicist perceives gravitational forces, atomic interactions, and mathematical relationships in the same physical space where another simply sees an empty room. So, what this tells us is that reality is not objective and absolute, it is deeply tied to who is observing, how they are observing. Let me remind you again that yes, there could be an absolute reality outside of the perception, but we are not getting into it at this point. So, a profound example is a Rubin vase illusion, where the same image can be seen as either two faces or a single vase. The external stimulus does not change, only the perception does. This proves that mind constructs its own interpretation of reality, and what we call truth is often a selected version of what is possible to perceive. Now, if this is true, for simple visual stimuli, imagine how much of what we take as reality is actually a construct of the mind. Another compelling analogy from quantum mechanics is that Schrodinger's cat paradox, where a cat inside a box is both alive and dead until observed. This paradox suggests that reality does not have a fixed state until it is measured or perceived. This brings us to the question that, the question that we have to wonder is, how come the same so-called scientific truth that was discovered a few decades ago is refuted by the same science which discovered the earlier truth? So the best example is quantum mechanics versus Newtonian mechanics. We know both are true. And we know, for example, that matter could be seen as energy or as physical entity, right? So the first, as I said, was phenomenology. Second is epistemology, which is knowledge as we know it, knowledge as a mental construct. So epistemology, the study of knowledge, further reinforces this. Knowledge is not simply discovered, it is constructed based on experience and cognition. So even scientific truths evolve, like Newtonian physics versus quantum physics, quantum mechanics. What was considered to be absolute fact is often revised with a new paradigm. So quantum mechanics is now further challenged. Even it has further challenged even Einsteinian notions of fixed reality, showing that an observer can influence the outcome of an experiment. This raises the question: if knowledge is mind dependent, how do we talk about an objective world beyond the mind? So Einstein himself recognized this limitation when he famously said, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." In other words, truth extends beyond mere measurement. What is meaningful may not be measurable, and what is measurable may not be meaningful. And this happens truly, very much true in corporates, wherein we have told ourselves in corporates, I'm from corporate, I'm a technologist, that what you cannot measure, you cannot control. There is this obsession about measurement, measuring everything, and trying to measure even things that are immeasurable, and not measuring or not qualifying things that are really important for people to work in an organization as a social collaborative network. So, theoretical knowledge is definitely useful, but it cannot replace direct experience. Thus, reality as we know it is not simply observed, it is continuously being constructed by the mind. So, we spoke about phenomenology, we spoke about epistemology. Third is ontology. Does reality exist outside the mind? So the ontology, the study of being and existence, challenges us to the question whether there is reality outside of the mind, or if all that exists is an interpretation woven by consciousness itself. Let us consider two perspectives. First is materialistic view. The world exists independent of the observer. The mind simply observes it as it is. In this materialistic view, we consider ourselves living entities like us, like human beings, outside of the world, separated from the world, as though a machine is looking at, a camera is looking at the world outside itself. The Vedantic view or the classical Eastern view is world as we experience. It's a projection of consciousness and shaped by the way the mind perceives and organizes information. The Vedantic perspective argues that our experience of the world is not separate from our consciousness, right? So we else. So these both positions, can we reconcile these positions and combine these, synthesize this into a postmodern, so-called postmodern scientific approach, so that we don't end up missing out a lot of truth because we are stuck to empirical approach in science. So world, there is a universe, a vast intelligence, a substratum on which the mind has been built. So, but then we have to make Vedanta relatable to the level of the common man, even if we have to dilute it with a clear understanding that we are diluting it, because otherwise we end up, our discourses end up becoming something which we cannot experience. Soul. So many of these Vedantic highest ideals are difficult to grasp unless they are made relatable to direct experience. However, if we begin by examining the mind, we can create a bridge to deeper understanding. Instead of speaking about consciousness in an abstract way, let us begin with how the mind organizes reality and structures it and presents it to us. Instead of discussing self-realization as a mystical goal, which is required when we sit in a personal space and want to contemplate or worship a personal deity, that is very valid. But in public, instead of discussing self-realization, can we talk about how self-awareness changes perception in daily life? Instead of debating whether the world is real or illusion, we must ask, how does our perception of it shape? How does our perception of the world shape our lived experience? How can we integrate Vedantic wisdom into our daily life? This means that we must distill Vedantic concepts into experiences that are accessible today, even if that means dilution of Vedantic thought or Eastern philosophy or Western philosophy, as long as we do with clarity and awareness of why it is being done. One of the biggest misinterpretation in translating Sanskrit or any classical language is the way, for example, Maya is commonly rendered in translation as illusion. So when you say the world is Maya, so it's an illusion. Is it an illusion really? Do we experience the world as an illusion? I don't think so. I don't experience the world as illusion. It may be true at a different level, paramarthika level, but at a vyavaharika level, the world is as real as anything else that I can perceive. But if we mean illusion as something completely false, we misinterpret the concept. We misinterpret the original thinker of Advaita. He never called it illusion, right? Instead, if Maya is a cognitive process, a way in which mind organizes, categorizes, and structures our experience and our sense of reality, a framework. So the mind shapes reality. Everyday examples. My memories of the past change over time, not because the past itself changes, because the mind reconstructs it differently each time we recall it. This means that our experience of life is deeply mind dependent. If we recognize that perception is fluid, that knowledge is shaped by mental constructs and that reality is an engagement of the mind with the world, we become less rigid in our beliefs, more open to experience, more aware of how consciousness is shaping our personal and collective worlds. So, if our reality is shaped by the mind, then how do we deepen our understanding of it? For far too long, we relied on external measurements, assuming that only what is measurable is real. But as we shall see, the most profound aspects of life, love, intuition, beauty, cannot be reduced to numbers. This takes us to the limits of empiricism and the need for a broader approach which does not reject empiricism but goes beyond it to embrace other forms of knowing and knowledge. So the need for experiential knowledge to complement empirical knowledge. For centuries, science has thrived on measurement and empirical validation. If something cannot be seen, quantified, tested, it is often dismissed as subjective or unreliable. This method has given us extraordinary technological and medical advancements, but it has also narrowed the way we define reality. So let us ask ourselves, can everything that truly matters be measured? Many of the history's greatest discoveries, scientific, literary, and artistic, begin with a gut feel, a dream, or a moment of inspiration. Now, if you read the works of great scientists like Newton, their notebooks are so profound, balancing poetry, beauty of words with scientific empiricism. They start with a hypothesis, they start with the imagination, and then they go on to narrowing it down to hypothesis, testing, and proving the hypothesis. And then they repeat this. So what we understand from this is that scientists true scientific approach is a synthesis of intuitive, imaginative, uh, open-ended thinking, balanced by more logical, more convergent, and reductionist thinking. We need more expansionist and reductionist approach to discovering new knowledge that has been denied to us or that has been rejected as non-scientific. Right? And this happens everywhere. This happens in medicine. We have the modern medicine relies on empirical evidence, relies on statistical significance. But we know statistical significance. People who have studied statistics understand that statistical significance and correlation is not causation. But often modern medicine makes this mistake of arriving at definitive truth based on statistical significance and correlation. So often this reasoning and inference is flawed, but that part is never spoken about because everyone believes, the world believes that the modern science or modern medicine is all about science, whereas traditional medicine, whichever country it is, which is based on other non-scientific approaches like faith healing or sound or smell or any of the sense-based healing is not scientific. They dismiss placebo as unscientific. But then placebo, if placebo is able to cure, so be it. Why not? So this does not mean that empirical science is flawed. It just means that it is incomplete when dealing with consciousness and subjective experience. If science has evolved from Newtonian determinism to quantum uncertainty, why should consciousness studies remain rigidly empirical? Just as physics had to expand its boundaries to include quantum mechanics, so too must we expand the boundaries of consciousness research. Thus, if we have to truly understand consciousness, we must expand our framework of knowledge to include three complementary ways of knowing, which
So how
is
do we
complement empirical evidence-based knowledge acquisition with experiential and self-knowledge, which
so
is how do we expand the scientific framework without abandoning scientific framework? How do we synthesize that with complementary approach? It is not about rejection of science. But the science must recognize that certain aspects of reality cannot be reduced to numbers and measurements. So, theories of consciousness must include direct experience as part of legitimate study. Interdisciplinary approaches bridging empirical methods, experiential practices, and experiential insights are needed to create a fuller picture of consciousness. So, if the limits of empirical science prevent us from accessing deeper subjective states of knowledge, what alternative approaches do we have? This is where the heterophenomenology provides an elegant bridge, allowing us to take subjective experience seriously while maintaining a scientific rigor. So, what is heterophenomenology? The term heterophenomenology means the phenomenology of another, a way of studying how people report their conscious experiences without assuming that those experiences are either real or illusory. So, heterophenomenology was proposed by Dennett, and its approach is very simple yet very revolutionary. Instead of rejecting subjective experiences, heterophenomenology listens to them carefully, records them systematically, and studies them as valid data. It treats first person reports scientifically, not assuming them to be absolute truth, but also not rejecting them outright. In doing so, it balances empirical rigor with lived experience, which is very important, offering a way to engage with consciousness that does not fall into either extreme, either blind acceptance or rigid skepticism. Why is this required? Because science has traditionally struggled to study experiences that cannot be externally verified. Let us explore why traditional scientific methods fail to capture consciousness. And traditional empirical science faces significant limitation when studying consciousness. For example, near death experience, right? So many people who have clinical death report floating above their body and so on and so forth. And neuroscience can measure brain activity before and after cardiac arrest, but it cannot access what the person actually experienced. Heterophenomenology allows us to study these reports systematically without dismissing them as hallucinations or treating them as mystical truth. So, heterophenomenology offers a third path. It does not dismiss experience as illusion like reductionist neuroscience might. It does not blindly accept subjective claims as absolute truth as some spiritual traditions might. Instead, heterophenomenology treats consciousness as a process, something that can be studied through both first person reports and third person scientific analysis. So, how do we apply heterophenomenology? A. Collecting reports of consciousness experience, asking individuals describing their conscious experience through structured interviews, self reports, and controlled experiments. Second step, treating these reports as data without bias. So, without getting into the conclusion that this seems to be an illusion or a hallucination, but recording it as it is. This is what the person has reported, and this is the data for me. Third is finding patterns across multiple reports. So you get multiple reports and start to build a pattern. Now, this is very important because conventionally, this has been done using manual analysis of data gathered from hundreds of experiments. But with generative AI, what my experience has been is that generative AI is able to synthesize and find patterns among large amount of non-structured, unstructured textual data that has been recorded from talking to these subjects and recording them. So generative AI would play a big role in future to enrich the science of hetero and the practice of heterophenomenology. So the fourth step here is correlating subjective and objective findings. So finally, heterophenomenology attempts to link first person subjective reports with third person scientific data. For example, if a person describes feeling a loss of self awareness in deep meditation, the brain scans show reduced activity in the default mode network. So it is primarily correlating what the person actually experiences with scientific experiments. So, heterophenomenology can be a good bridge between science and experience, scientific, empirical knowledge, and the intuitive, experiential knowledge or the perception. Right? It does not dismiss anything as illusion, nor does it becomes go overboard and then call everything that is experienced as real. It does a balance of both, gets the best of both the worlds. So, final thought. So, the future of consciousness studies, the application of heterophenomenology could revolutionize fields such as meditation research, psychedelic studies, near-death experiences, a lot of inner, psychological, so-called, I don't want to call it disorders, psychological um, states. Thus, heterophenomenology represents a new science of consciousness, one that values inner experience and while maintaining scientific rigor. It does not seek to explain consciousness away, but to truly engage with consciousness. So, if you are to truly understand consciousness, we need an approach that integrates both empirical rigor and lived experience. The future of consciousness studies depends on our ability to embrace multiple ways of knowing and not ignoring or dismissing or not getting biased by any one way of knowing. It's like a synthesis of all the knowledge acquisition techniques that are present in traditional communities as well as modern science. So we have science and experience towards an integrated understanding. So as we arrive at the conclusion of this conference, it is not simply a closing statement, but an invitation to deepen the inquiry. So let me end my talk with a 10-point summary of our takeaway from this conference. Point number one is the mind shapes reality. Consciousness is not just a passive observer, it actively constructs reality as seen in phenomenology, epistemology, and quantum mechanics. Second point is a need to go beyond the modern science reductionist approach and to take a more systemic approach and interconnected approach. That brings us to the third point, which is that it is a patterns that shape reality, that connects. So meaning is not just in isolated facts, but in relationships, which is what Bateson had, advocated. So it mirrors Vedanta's non-dualism and phenomenology. Fourth is science must expand its scope beyond empirical science, which is valuable but incomplete. It must integrate first-person experience, intuition, and direct inquiry. Fifth, consciousness as a self-organizing process. Insights from Prigoghine's dissipative structures and Varela's autopoiesis show that consciousness evolves through feedback loops, such as much like the mind and reality co-create each other. Sixth is bridging East and West, Eastern concepts, Eastern wisdom with the Western wisdom. Seventh is experiential knowledge matters apart from experimental science. Eighth is heterophenomenology offers a middle path propagated by Dennett. The approach provides a way to study subjective experiences without dismissing them as illusions. 9, a multidisciplinary approach is required to study consciousness. And 10, a call for an integrated inquiry as we move forward. So, which means the final call for action for us is the journey of consciousness is not just about reaching a final answer, but it is about redefining the questions. Let us move forward with a great deal of curiosity, openness, and a commitment of integrating knowledge from all knowledge sources and including the experimental and experiential approach. Thank you, and may our exploration of consciousness continue beyond this conference. Namaste, Jai Hind.